I hope that you've had a nice and restful sleep, and that you were able to enjoy the dinner last night, and you were able to network and feel in touch with each other. I mean, that was also the aim of this event, that it would be a networking event, and that we would learn about what other people were actually doing in this field. So please make sure that you continue that discussion. Well, this morning, I'd like to take this opportunity again to introduce David Pedler to you. And Dr. Pedler is the Director of the Research at the National Headquarters of Veterans Affairs in Canada. And yesterday you were able to hear from David quite a bit about what was to be achieved and what Canada was working towards also. And I think on the whole, the idea is to go forward in understanding some of these differences that are occurring, and how can we actually learn from some of these good practices, and how we can actually build on these good practices. So this morning, I won't bother to introduce David again in great depth and length, because it's also on your agenda, and I hope David don't mind. But I think that this morning we'll be dealing with the transition, and we've got people from Yonsei. So I leave David to actually introduce this to you, and to be our facilitator this morning. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so it's my pleasure to open our panel this morning to talk about transition from military service to civilian life. Maybe I'll just sort of open it speaking from a Canadian perspective. And when you're in the business of veteran benefits and veteran care, you have to make decisions about what the priorities are in the business lines that you lead. And so a decision that Canada made, I think, between the year 2000 and 2006 was that transition from military service to civilian life wasn't just a business line, it's actually our main business line. That's what we think is most important. It's not the only thing, but we actually think it's the most important thing. That's because transition encompasses a wide range of domains of well-being that impact veterans while they're transitioning. So a bad transition itself can lead to harmful outcomes. But when most veterans transition, they're going to be civilians for 40 or 50 years after they leave. And so if you get transition right, you're going to maximize their well-being, not just in transition, but across their life course. And that's what we're all about. So, so I think you'll see the multidimensional nature of transition when we go through the great presentations that we're going to hear this morning. And so without further introduction about what we're up to here, it's my pleasure to start with our speakers. Our first one is Dr. Carl Castro, and each talk will be kept to a strict 15 minutes. Thank you.
Well, welcome back for day two. I'm going to just jump right into this. I usually give a whole big spiel about the importance of theory and why theory is important, but I'll hit that along the way. So I will jump. Can folks see this? Okay, perfect. So purpose of the presentation is to provide an overview of the military transition theory that I and folks at our center have been working on for the past 4 years now almost, and provide examples of hypotheses derived from the military transition theory. So one of the things that I tell my students, and actually I have to tell colleagues, it's not a hypothesis unless you derived it from a theory. Otherwise, it's just a prediction, it's a research question, but it's not technically a hypothesis by definition. So good theories tell us a lot, allows us to understand important constructs. So here's my outline. For time purposes, I won't go through the outline in detail. So here's the statement of the military transition theory. So it states that the transition of entering the military, the transitions during military service, and the transition of leaving the military create susceptibility to negative outcomes. That, in a nutshell, is the theory. So you will see immediately the theory isn't just focused on leaving the military, because there are important aspects of joining the military. And there are important transitions within the military. Most of us think about preparing to go to a deployment, returning home from a deployment, changing duty stations, those kinds of things. So I will focus on the leaving the military aspect, but the reason why it's important to understand the transition into the military is because that is also where a lot of really negative outcomes occur in the military. So for example, 25% of all suicides in the Army occur within the first 2 years of military service. So if you think about that, and you think about where would you develop an intervention, there should be an intervention probably when folks come in. So I think you heard yesterday, for example, on suicides, that if you just looked at those who have deployed and those who haven't deployed, that there's no difference in suicide rates, right? That's correct. However, if you exclude those suicides that occurred within the first 2 years of military service during that transition, there's a huge deployment-related effect on suicides. So the military transition theory, I think, is important because not only does it explain the relationships of important constructs that we're interested in, but it also provides insight into when things are likely to go sideways, when problems are likely to occur. So for those of you who are in the military, I always would ask this question: what is the most difficult military maneuver? Hint, it's an Army maneuver. So sometimes I get Air Force examples. This is an Army example. So the most difficult military maneuver is doing a battle handoff while engaged with the enemy. So if you think about, I'm shooting at the enemy and Dave's coming up behind me and I'm shooting and he started shooting and I back away, okay? That's a major transition, right? So transitions are very difficult to do and stressful if they're not done correctly. So this is what the transition theory really focuses on, but within a military construct. So the three most important constructs of the military transition theory is that military culture and experiences are really important. So the theory says the culture, there's a different culture in the military that's different from a civilian culture. And understanding those cultural differences are critical for how people transition into the military, but more importantly, how they transition out of the military. So in some ways, you have to think about transitioning out of the military as immigrating to a new country. You don't have a job, you're losing your housing, you may not have good finances, go. So if I told you today you're moving to India in 90 days, what would you have to do? Well, where would I live? I don't know, sort it out. I got to get a job. What are you going to do? Okay? So you may have social support, but most of your friends you also lose, right? You'll leave them behind. And yeah, you may still stay in contact with them, but your work friends have certainly changed. And then, of course, I've already mentioned transitions are very important. I'll give you a kind of a list of those. And also health and well-being. So these are the main outcomes, but these are the important constructs that the military transition tries to address. So here are some of the key characteristics of the military culture. And you heard this yesterday from Jeff. The unique mission of the military is to fight and win our nation's wars. All right? That's the main mission. That's why the military exists. Can the military do other things? Absolutely. Is that their main mission? No. Okay? But that doesn't mean they can't do other things, because in the being able to fight and win your nation's wars, you can do a lot of other things too, and the military does. Peacekeeping missions, humanitarian missions, disaster relief, okay? And this involves exposure to extreme trauma, so it's very important that we keep in mind potential traumatic experiences. The military is also a value-based organization, and I can't overemphasize that. Being a value-based organization is very different than being in a capitalistic society where it's profit-based, okay? That's what's valued, is making money, paying bills. The military, doesn't think like that. They're just thinking values. That's really the thing that holds it together. There's collective socialism in the military. Anyone who's in the military has a job. They have housing, they have medical, they have dental, they have commissary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I know socialism is a dirty word in America, but the military is structured in a very socialistic way. It's hierarchical. We all think about that immediately. Chain of command, you do as you're told. But it's also important in the military is subordination is highly valued. We want people who are going to do as they're told. Okay? And if you don't do as you're ordered, that's a problem. Okay? So you all probably have heard the opposite of subordination, which is insubordination, which means you're not doing what you're told. So we value the opposite of that. It's unique formal, informal rules and norms. Teamwork, cohesion, and leadership are highly valued within the military. And then, of course, we have this unique and nuanced language. So these are just some of the key characteristics. And when you think of military transitions, it asserts that transitions are inherently stressful for a variety of reasons. Here are the 4 main reasons why transitions are inherently stressful. It produces changes in relationships. And that came across yesterday. I think a lot of folks mentioned it. Relationships are fundamental to well-being. Your relationship with yourself, your relationship to your family, your partner, your spouse, relationships to your co-workers. Often people don't think about this as an important relationship, but one of the most important relationships is your relationship with your supervisor, your boss. And then, of course, your relationship with your community and all of your community organizations. These relationships are very important. It involves changes in work context. It disrupts your social support networks, especially when you move from one location to another. And keep in mind, the military does this on a reoccurring basis. And it challenges your personal and social identity. So many people talk about how, your identity as a military service member is fundamentally challenged during a transition. And the reason for that is multiple. When I enlisted in the military, when I joined the infantry, my drill instructor told me that I was better than civilians because I'm serving my country, while all of these freeloading civilians are enjoying their freedom on my back. So they made me feel special and unique. But then when you join this group, all of a sudden, wait, I'm better than you, but now I have to work for you. So it requires sort of a change in your own identity. Did everything I learned in the military, is that useless? Is it valueless? So this, I won't talk about that in detail, but a lot of work has been done on the identity piece, but that's an important aspect of why transitions can be stressful. So here are types of military transitions. I've mentioned some of them, but joining the military, going to your first duty station, which is not where you go to basic training. Temporary duties for training, where you go for long periods of time, field training exercises, sea duty, deployments. I mentioned there's a few different types of deployments here that most people are familiar with. Frequent duty relocations, every 2 to 3 years, 4 years, moving a service member and their family. These are transitions. And then finally, leaving the military is a major one. So these are some of the key health and well-being outcomes that the military transition tries to encompass. Employment, health, we've talked about, housing, strong relationships with family and friends, community, finances, legal, and general well-being and contentment. So, if you're going to ask one question to a veteran, and you just say, hey, are you enjoying life? And if they say yes, I leave them alone. Because a lot of veterans don't want help right away. They maybe want help later in time, and that's okay. The point is that the ultimate goal of all of these other things is so you're enjoying life, all right? You only really have a job so you can get money so you can enjoy life. Now, hopefully you enjoy the job you have. That's even better, right? But these are sort of the main well-being and health outcomes of the theory. So people always ask me, so what does a successful military transition looks like? So here is, I think, a useful one sentence. This is what a successful transition looks like. A successful military transition includes a meaningful, well-paying job, strong relationships with family, friends, and community, and a sense of well-being and contentment. I think we all would agree that if we had that, that sounds pretty good, okay? Now, it's not perfect. There's some nuances there, but in general, this is what a successful transition would look like. So now I'm going to just quickly go through some examples and the empirical support for the military transition theory, because it's not very useful unless the data actually supports what I'm saying, right? Then it just becomes literally theoretical. So one of the theories is that the military transition postulates that returning home from combat and deployments can make, well, I have 5 minutes, all right? Well, we're not going to read that. We'll just go into this one here. So military transition postulates new recruits to the military to be more vulnerable to sexual assaults due to their lack of strong social supports. Okay, so this makes a very specific prediction about sexual assaults, the lack of a social support. So then you would say, then we would expect to see an increase, right? And in point of fact, you do. Now, the important thing to point out is, especially around sexual assaults and transitions, is this is not unique to the military. You see a similar pattern for students going to universities, okay? So any type there are transitions, there is vulnerability, right? Another area where this is very relevant is for undocumented immigrants are very susceptible to sexual assault and other types of predatory behaviors because of their vulnerability and unwillingness to report acts of violence towards them or fear of being captured and then kicked out of the country. So when you look at the data amongst veterans as well, this is data that we've also collected, just showing that when you look at veterans, that the rates of sexual assault, sexual harassment increase is very prevalent within the military. And this is not unique to the U.S. military. I know the U.S. military gets a lot of bad publicity, but the reason why we have these data is because the U.S. military is one of the few militaries in the world that actually collects this information. Other militaries don't collect the information because they don't want to know the answer and then have to deal with the issues. But if you look at WHO reports on worldwide sexual assault rates, it's a global problem, sexual assault. And the U.S. is right in the middle. They're not higher than anybody else. They're right in the middle. And the military rates are right in the middle of those global indicators. And I know that there are some nations who say we don't have these problems, but they do. So we know, for example, 85% of sexual assaults among female service members occur within the first 2 years of military service. But our training approach in the military is to give every single person every year for the rest of their life sexual assault prevention training, as opposed to focusing it during the most vulnerable periods and in a different way that targets the most vulnerable. Another, and I'll stop here after this one, is the military transition theory postulates that service members are at most risk of dying by suicide when they join the military and when they return from deployment and when they leave the military. And of course, we know that if you look at data, certainly among veterans, and usually when people talk about veteran suicide rates, most of these suicides are occurring within the first 2 years of the service member leaving the military, when their social networks are disrupted, when they don't have a job, when they're struggling in this transition process. So this tells us this is where we need to be targeting interventions. Additional support is around these critical transition points. And the data is really so compelling. And it wasn't actually, the data actually wasn't collected to see when these events happened, but when you just look at the timing of them, this is what emerges. So in summary, military transition theory emphasizes the importance of the military as a unique culture. I can't overstate that. It provides a useful approach, I think, for studying how important constructs are related. There's lots of theories that do that. But more importantly, the military transition theory makes predictions when issues are likely to occur. And so we can target and develop interventions around those transitions. And there is very strong support. I've given a couple of examples, but there's lots of other examples I could give that supports the importance of these theoretical predictions and the empirical data. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Castro. So next we have Dr. Park, who's Associate Dean and Professor at the School of Social Welfare, who has done the work she's going to talk to us today with her team, Dr. Kim and Dr. Lee. So I want to welcome our colleagues from the great institution of Yonsei. Thank you.
Good morning. I am Soo-young Park. I have working at Yonsei University as a professor. Today I am going to talk about the successful transition to civil life among the veterans of Vietnam War in Korea. Contents is introduction, current approaches in Korea, problem in current approaches, suggestions. The Korean government dispatched 320,000 soldiers during the Vietnam War from 1964 to 1973. A large number of Korean soldiers were exposed to herbicides sprayed in the United States for removing the dense jungles during Vietnam War. Korean soldiers exposed to herbicides were not noticed and informed about the risk of Agent Oranges at the time and have been neglected soldiers for a long time. The Agent Oranges cause, as you know, cancers, cardiovascular effects, neurological disorders, immune system collapse, and even reproductive problems. Korean government began to provide treatment and compensation to them from 1993, nearly 20 years later after the Vietnam War. Approximately 64,000 veterans have been identified as victims of Agent Oranges and received government medical compensation benefits. However, about 90,000 veterans who were not entitled to receive medical and compensation benefits have been suffering from disease and the hardship of life. There are different perspectives of the issue between government and veterans in Korea. First, government have poor understanding of characteristics of veterans exposed to Agent Orange, and focusing on financial benefits and medical treatment, and then treat veterans exposed to Agent Oranges as just one of poor people. In contrast, veterans think that Korean government did not pay people proper compensation. They also want to be recognized as a patriot contributing to Korean economic development. And they want to be treated as men of national merit of the war. Korean government enacted the Defoliant Act in 1993 for supporting veterans. Subject is divided into three type group. One type 1 group patient include patients suffering from actual after effects of defoliant. And type 2 are patients suffering from potential after effects of defoliant. And then type 3 are offspring of patients suffering from actual after effects of defoliant. As you can see, table 1, the number of registrants is 154,277. Type 1 group has 7 grade and non-rated diabetes. Rated. Diabetes diabetes mellitus type 2 is the most prevalent, about 3–5%. Type 2 group are classified into the 3 group: severe, moderate, mild group. Hypertension is the most prevalent, about 46%. Figure 1 showed the registration of and verification process to receive compensation benefit. Look at the table 4. Benefits are benefits consist of compensation, financial benefits, education support, medical benefits, employment support, education support, employment support, medical benefits. This program has several limitations. For example, non-rated veterans with potential after effects of defoliant have many difficulties in receiving. For example, veterans have difficulty in proving their damages due to Agent Orange. Fractional eligibility criteria limited to recognized only disease. Non-rated, receiving just minimum medical benefits account for 44% of the total registrant. And regarding benefits and services, government mainly concentrated on medical benefits, while there are little psychosocial service, but higher mental disease among the veterans exposed to Agent Oranges. For example, high PTS and depression and low self-esteem, high aggression and anger. Also, lack of professionals in military social work field. And regarding delivery system, The most important problem is low accessibility to service resources. For example, short of related facilities, low physical accessibilities. Actually, most of facilities was located in the metropolitan areas. Limited information accessibility is a big problem. And then government is dependent on public sector. This program is dependent on public sector. Due to close characteristics of Korean military and a lack of concerns about their integration to community among private sector. Lastly, public image toward the veterans. Korean people think that veteran is aggressive political tendency. Also, on difference on veterans' life experience among civilians, and people tend to not respect the sacrifices of veterans of Vietnam War, unlike veterans of Korean War. These pictures is a public image of veterans exposed to Agent Oranges in media. We try to suggest new approaches for successful transition among veterans. First, regarding subject, the most important solution is solving a blind spot. Government needs to expand coverage regarding non-rated who solely depend on medical benefits, and need to include family support. As for benefits and services, government also need to new total benefits program including psychosocial services as well as cash compensation and medical service, and need to provide more systemic and professional care services to victims. Need to professionals in military social work field. And then regarding delivery system, government need to improve accessibility to information and network related agencies in the community, and need to establish a systemic plan which encompasses wide ranges of victims' issue. And also need to train professional military social work for individualized assessment, planning, and case management. Lastly, veteran organizations need to provide various services for successful transition of veterans. And then government need to lead a campaign for successful transition among veterans. Thank you for listening to. Thank you.
Thanks to Dr. Park. That was wonderful. And so next in our speaker list is Dr. Choi, who's a professor of social welfare at Yonsei University, and colleague Dr. Zhang, who's a doctoral student. So we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Hi everyone. I'm Gyung Jung. This research and presentation being conducted with Professor Jae-sung Choi. This study review job transition for military veterans in South Korea. Yeah. As you can see, there is a total of 5 sections that will be covered throughout this presentation. First, I'd like to start from background and problem. Korean military implement the strict retirement plan by ranked structured social military officer, usually retire involuntarily in their 40s or 50s. In one's life cycle, people usually consume mostly in 40s and 50s. Therefore, they encounter this difficult caused by their elderly discharge. The average employment rate of Korean veterans is 58.1%, and this is far less the amount compared to other countries. And the period of veterans employment and training service program is quite short. Only 12 months of education was given for veterans whose period of service is over 30 years. In this situation, dissatisfaction about the BTS program arise. Following Ministry of Patriots and Veteran Affairs, 48.4% of subjects respond that job in accordance with the requirements of veterans are insufficient, and 29.4% point out sufficient customized supporting service and the lack of related research. So, a veteran and researcher recognize that there is need improving service related to veterans employment supporting service. This aim of the study is to analyze characteristics and conditional of the JTSP in Korean and suggest some implication for further improvement of this program. Before this, let's take a look at the norm of the veteran first. Under Article 2 of the Veteran Assistance Act, a veteran encompasses the personnel who discharged or related from military service under the military service law or the Military Personnel Management Act. From now on, I'm going to check the employment status of veterans in Korean society. Every year, about 7,000 veterans have been transported to civic life. Among them, only 58.1% get their job. The reason for the low employment rate can be inferred from various facts, effect. First, the difference of expected between the veterans and the employers, such as types of occupation, wage, etc. And second, a lack of practical job education. Third, insufficient PR about veterans' support potential capability can be regionalized well. And fourth, no incentive for hiring veterans for employers. And the last, burnout leads to lack of expertise and low adaptability in private companies to cause prejudice avoidance about hiring veterans. This chart shows the basic job skill of Korean veterans. The skill can be sorted by 8 categories. Among them, veterans have strengths in 5 categories: situation handling, collaboration with others, problem solving, division maker, and resource management. However, their weakness can be found is originality and creativity, personal relation, and communication skill. However, current job training program for veterans are not focusing on the weakness, but only on a question of leading to getting the certification about the limit area. Veteran support program consists of 5 categories: employment support, educational support, medical care support, loan support, and legal support. However, as you can notice that the program tend to focus on the employment support. Employment support was delivered through adaptitude test, employment counseling, startup counseling, giving job information, and holding a job fair. We compared the budget of Ministry of Patriots and Veteran Affairs of Korea and the Department of Veterans Affairs of U.S. Expecting budget for pension and compensation of disability of U.S. U.S. tend to put a lot of budget on medical care. But in Korea, 72.2% of budget is spending on occupational support. Also, yearly budget for one veteran is quite different. U.S. spent 30 times more than Korea for one veteran. Yeah, so from next slide, from Professor Choi, we will continue presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. Mr. Chung presented about the scope of this issue and the background of these issues. And now I'll present what's the structure of a Korean veteran support program and what is about how we can improve a Korean veteran support program. As you see, in these issues, the Korean government is still far behind comparing to other countries like Israel and US. Yesterday, I was surprised, Israel case, they have a mental health officer. We do not have such a system. maybe someday we have to develop such a program. And another shocking information yesterday was about USGI bill. I really understand the value of USGI bill, even though you are still criticizing the status of USGI bill. In case of South Korea, really envy your case. Someday in Korea, we have to develop such a GI bill for South Korea. This slide is the structure of veterans employment support. Our support program is divided in before discharge, after discharge. Before discharge, we provide 3 years preparation education system. After discharge, we provide another 3 years service programs. However, the contents and quality of this program is very low. I mean, most of them do not have a chance to access the information about this program. So we have to have the structure, but the contents is very poor and very low. And this is about the before discharge program. Before discharge program is managed by Ministry of National Defense. They have set up an institute, Military Outplacement Training Institute. This institute covers all veterans to be to prepare job placement. And after discharge, we have another organization under government, which called Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs. They charge of after discharge programs. What are the problems of this system? I point out 4 problems. One is a perfunctory veteran special employment. Government expect every private enterprise hire veterans, but is just like a nominal expectation, just expectation. So private enterprise do not hire veterans as much. Another problem is low quality of employment. Even if they have been hired, their employment status is very low. Another problem is low expertise of veterans. Veterans themselves are evaluated from private enterprise. Their job skills is very low, which means Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Veterans Affairs not prepare them to adopt private enterprise. The final problem is a dualized employment support system. This means our veteran support program is split it before discharge and after discharge. 2 ministries, which is looks like closely related, but they do not communicate each other. That is a big problem in our case. This one is from the perspective of private enterprise, why they think about veterans, why do not hire veterans in private enterprise. First reason is the lack of expertise. They evaluate veterans as very low skills. And this, I'd like to skip this one. Yeah, and this one is finally. I'd like to talk about the direction. There is some bills pending in Congress. There has been several trials to improve, make an amendment on Veterans Assistance Act. One idea is requiring military career in their new job. When veterans get a job in private enterprise, then by law they count their military career. And another one is introducing an accreditation system for excellent companies in hiring veterans, which means government recognize private enterprise because they are successfully hiring veterans. And South Korean government has another 5-year scheme right now related to veterans. They're trying to one-stop service integration system for veterans. As I told you earlier, we have a big problem because before discharge and after discharge, both systems do not communicate each other. They recognize these problems, so they built up a new system, a one-stop integrated system. And another one is that they are expanding online and college education programs 2 to 3 years before their discharge. And we need increased budget, absolutely, too tiny, too small to veteran programs. And integrate veteran support system, increase collaboration between 2 ministries, and the systematic evaluation of job training and education. And when we investigate these issues, I was surprised. There is no solid research. There is no data useful. I think we found university and researchers have to pay more attention on this issue. And expertise and diversity veterans support program. We need enhanced family support programs. Our veterans support programs do not recognize family support program or psychosocial programs, not much. And really final one, recent changes with the new president. In Korean government, we selected a new president recently. Now it took about 2 weeks, really a brand new president. I found the news when I arrived in Los Angeles 2 days ago. Our new president appointed a new minister for the Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs. The first, the new minister, who is the first female minister, and she was also the first female helicopter pilot, Lieutenant Colonel retired. She has a strong interest developing veterans family support program. So I expect some changes in these issues because of her role and her interest. And also our new president has a strong interest in these issues and also young ages issues. President has some background with civil rights movement in community, and actually he's from a lawyer. So he is doing so far successfully showing a presidential position. So we expect better situation. And some people expect the new president might be increase salary for the private. I mean the soldiers. So far, we don't use the salary for the soldiers because they are mandatory service. But some people, some politicians think about and asking increase the wage up to minimum wage. This is a big change, and if they made this, then veteran service programs will have a big change. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. And our next speaker from Australia is Dr. John Cooper, who we invite to talk to us. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Excuse me. I set the precedent yesterday of having to correct misinformation I disseminated the previous evening, and it appears that I need to do it again. So, Courtney, in Australia, health spend as a proportion of GDP is just under 10%. 10%, 9.2, 9.6. I should have known that, of course. Okay. So I want to provide an overview of the recent history of military to civilian transition in Australia. Given my background and affiliations, my focus and mindset will relate to the mental health issues predominantly. But over the past 15 years, the profile of transition has improved from a very low base to today's fairly comprehensive system. I've had cause to reflect upon the distant past and realised that Australian veterans after the First and Second World Wars were provided with substantial support, including employment, housing and healthcare. It appears that not only were the homecomings of our Vietnam veterans problematic, but the service systems struggled to adapt to their transition needs, and there was a void in this work in this area for quite a while. So, in describing successful transition to civilian life, outlining both the problems and the responses, I want to present the strategic overview. To provide further context, Australia's first national mental health strategy was released in 1992, not that long ago. From a military perspective, the first comprehensive health status report was written in 2000. It contained no explicit reference to transition issues. It did, however, begin to focus on mental health issues, noting mental health illnesses were the second leading cause of medical invalidity retirements. The report conveyed concerns about emerging prominence of post-traumatic stress disorder claims following deployments by Australian peacekeepers to East Timor. This caused the bureaucracy to question this phenomenon. Why were so many claims coming forward at this point? And this also influenced the first Australian Defence Force mental health strategy that was released soon after in 2002. It began to discuss the issue of transition with a few paragraphs under the heading of separations from the ADF, the Australian Defence Force. A range of related problems were identified and various recommendations were made, some of them that still seem quite fresh and relevant today. In the second half of the 2000s and the lead up to a federal election, the Labor Party, in opposition, undertook to investigate the needs of veterans through a comprehensive Lifecycle package. They won the election, and we at Phoenix Australia, or as it was known at the time, the Australian Centre for Post-Traumatic Mental Health, was commissioned to implement the program of research and service development. One of the 9 initiatives was a transition mental health and family collaborative undertaken in Townsville in North Queensland, a garrison town. Through a process of investigation and liaison through focus groups with the various parties relevant to the topic, 5 areas of need for the project to focus on that related to transition were identified. These included the need for improved interagency collaboration, more effective engagement and communication practices within and between the services, better recognition of mental health problems and related issues by personnel and the assisting professionals, improved family-sensitive and inclusive practices, and more effective advice, support and treatments. One of my colleagues at the time who led this initiative had specifically trained in learning collaborative methodology, and he was keen to apply that to this project. So, from the initial investigations, 10 teams were formed representing 14 relevant services. They included a barracks medical centre, representatives from the Army battalions and the Air Force Base, vocational rehabilitation agencies, the ADF Transition Centre that had recently been formed, family services, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the Veterans and Veterans Families Counselling Service, along with some of their contracted private counsellors. The investigations and focus groups occurred in the initial phase. We then had 3 meetings where everybody came together for learning sessions, and between each learning session, the groups returned to their workplaces for the action periods, which were characterised by planning, implementing, reviewing what they had done, making adjustments, and continuing an active quality improvement process. It was successful. The Learning Collaborative proved to be effective in improving each of the 5 identified concerns around transition. However, its intense methodology was considered expensive in resources and time, leading to recommendations that if it was going to be applied around the country, it needed to be modified so it would be more efficient and affordable. But we were able to develop a fairly clear central conclusion that was presented to the government in our report, that the more effective collaboration within the complex service system demonstrably leads to a more seamless approach in supporting transitioning veterans. Overlapping with the Townsville Collaborative, David Dunt, a public health expert and epidemiologist, had been commissioned by the government to review mental health care in the ADF and transition through discharge. He undertook a very thorough and extensive review involving bringing the literature internationally into focus, looking at all of the Defence Force technical documents around transition. There were numerous public submissions, and he then underwent a data reduction exercise leading to the narrative and summary of his report. In his chapter on transition, he identified 5 areas of concern, leading to 5 specific recommendations that are outlined there. The concerns related to the discontinuities between the ADF and DVA service systems, duplication of the transition services that were evolving, inadequate training and support for the staff attempting to do this work, the need to improve family support and their involvement in the transition process, and he highlighted the lack of acknowledgement and validation of discharging members, leading to anger and resentment, and he hypothesised that this increased their invalidity. And here we see many of the themes identified in the Townsville Collaborative also being brought to light. The most recent ADF mental health strategy was released in 2011. It followed the important prevalence and wellbeing study led by Sandy McFarlane from Adelaide, and it preceded the subsequent action plan. In this strategy, we see transition has a new prominence. I hope you can see that. I went to great trouble to try and move it from a PDF onto the slide. But here we see transition in that left quadrant or left sector having a role in this model of occupational health and well-being that the military have adopted. It's comprehensive. It speaks to the tensions between processes of command and the needs of the health services within the ADF. It looks at strengths and resilience, and it identifies 5 specific recommendations that is relevant to transition. Again, highlighting concerns about the discontinuities between the service systems, the need for acknowledgement, and the need for more structured programs. I think we've covered that, and in the interests of moving along. So, where is Australia now in its handling of military to civilian transition? The ADF has an explicit developing program, a process of active quality improvement, and they're implementing their strategies in a staged and stepped way that's explicit in the literature. Transition support for military personnel is comprehensive. You could argue that there's even overkill. They have a handbook, there are seminars that discharging personnel need to attend, they are provided with fact sheets, and all of the major bases have centres specifically to deal with the issue of transition. The other very recent development is a shift in terms of pre-discharge medical reviews. Previously, they had been an opt-in service. Now they are compulsory, and in order to avoid them, discharging personnel have to opt out. Also, in the government's budget earlier this month, part of the money that I referred to yesterday has been put aside to provide non-liability free mental health care for all veterans. So no longer connected to service or deployments or the impairments or the diagnoses that come from their service. Any veteran with any mental health problem now gets free mental health care. In terms of providing a sense of the overview, this is the table of contents in the transition handbook that veterans get, and we see that beyond health and mental health, there's a significant focus on vocational rehabilitation, employment support, housing, as well as future financial services. So, Dave, you asked us to reflect upon the lessons that we've learned in relation to this topic. I consulted with my colleagues at Phoenix, and these are some of the things that we came up with. For those of us on the outside of this process, we believe that transition is actually harder than it seems, harder than we thought. And this is particularly so for lower ranks. We also feel that despite concerted efforts, military personnel will always be caught between choosing to put their hand up for early help in relation to their health or choosing to respond to operational demands, deployment and protecting their careers. These competing options remain nearly impossible for them to resolve, and I think they need further assistance with that. More still needs to be done to reduce the discontinuities between the two service systems, and an example of that is the medical and health records. There is a record in the military that is complete, but it stays there when they discharge into their civilian lives. To have a record that follows them would be an improvement. And certainly the focus on the social supports, particularly families and peers, We believe this will improve the effectiveness of transition and also help to keep our younger veterans safe. And finally, current research. The Transition and Wellbeing Research Program is currently underway and it specifically looks to examine this topic. Unfortunately, the early outcomes I'd hoped and was promised to be able to present to you have not yet been released. They remain embargoed by the government. The Transition and Wellbeing Research Program is the largest and most comprehensive study of this, in this area in Australia to date. There are 3 components, and Phoenix is lead in one of the streams of the Mental Health and Wellbeing Transition Study. The first part of the study is a further prevalence study that Sandy McFarlane's team in Adelaide are conducting. We're doing the Pathways to Care study, and then the other streams of the study that hopefully will provide a comprehensive examination of this area will follow. The Pathways to Care study is undertaking 8 analyses aiming to clarify that when a subject who is discharging reports a mental health concern, how many of them access treatment? Where do they get that treatment? How often does that treatment reflect evidence-based and best practice? What are their attitudes to treatment, their levels of satisfaction, and what barriers and stigma-related issues do they experience? And finally, what approaches are they utilising in terms of self-care? So stay tuned. I'm promised that the results will be published later this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. So, I guess that comes to me. I'm the final presenter on this panel. And let's see where we are here. Sorry. Oh, did I miss someone there? I think we're okay, yeah. No, it's all good. No, thank you for checking that. So, no, not at all. So, So I'm David Pedler, Research Director at Veterans Affairs Canada. I'm going to speak for a few minutes about military to civilian transition. It's partly from my country's perspective, but it's partly from my own perspective as well, having worked in this area for a while. First of all, where is transition? I mean, where do we see it every day? Well, yeah, we do. It's all around us. And for example, this is a proud graduate of the Price School. His name is Captain Chase Millsap. Captain Millsap, he was a person who actually knew he was a warrior when he was young and wanted to go into the military. And he ended up going to the Naval Academy as part of that sort of career dream he had. And after that, he went full-time in the military as a Green Beret. He was in the Battle of Mosul, would have done many, many special operations night after night. So by the time I met him, which was about 5 years after he released, this is a guy who was a millennial, and he basically spent 1/3 of his life in a, more or less either training for or in a bloody ground war in Iraq and Afghanistan. So when he came out, this was his thought to me when I asked him what transition was like for him. Transition is the hardest thing I have ever done. I simply had no idea who I was when I took the uniform off. This is a guy who's a very talented, capable, intelligent fellow, and transition was much harder than he expected it to be. So that's partly what this is all about. I'm going to talk a little bit about what military to civilian transition is, talk about some fundamentals for design of approaches and programs, speak to Canadian evidence for a minute, talk about research priorities, but first of all, I want to say that when I say MCT, that means military to civilian transition. That's an acronym you'll see a few times. And yesterday, Carl Castro talked to us about the word veteran, how it's used differently everywhere. The way it's going to be used here is a veteran in Canada is someone, you become a veteran that as soon as you've served 1 day. That's my definition for this talk. Just to put it in perspective by numbers, in the United States in 2015, about 218,000 military personnel released to civilian life. In Canada, it's about 10,000, 5,000 regular force, and 5,000 reserve members. Of course, there's a big difference in the numbers, but I can tell you for sure the issues that were talked about on this panel and the issues that we deal with in Canada are very similar. Transition is an issue that's quite similar, for example, across the presentations we've heard today. And the topics I'll be talking about are common ones across nations. So there's sort of four pillars that I want to talk about that I think are really important things for us to think about in transition. The first one I mentioned during my initial introduction. It's how big a priority do you think that should be amongst the priority setting activities for an organization that's either responsible for transition, that would be the Departments of Defense or the Department of Veterans Affairs. So I said earlier, Canada made it #1. And we did that around 2005 or 2006 by introducing legislation called the New Veterans Charter. So we were trying to cope with really a kind of a social covenant, coming to terms with fairness and what the right benefit package should be and what the right focus should be for contemporary veterans. We did not have a Vietnam cohort. So this was kind of the post-World War II cohort, which presented in a different generation, in a different era, with a different kind of demographic profile and different needs. So this is #1 for us. We've made it a big deal. The second thing I want to talk about in terms of how we approach veterans and veteran programming is I think that we should look at this in what I call the military and veteran life course. That means that we have to think about what happens upstream affects what happens downstream for veterans. And as Carl Castro pointed out, that helps us look at points of vulnerability across the military life experience, but also related to military exposures and experience before service, during service, and after service. A few more points on that is that, so what's transition all about? What's it from and what's it to? Well, I think Carl talked really well about military culture. So that's why it's a big deal. And another point I wanted to make there that General Talley made yesterday is another outcome of the uniqueness of military culture is that veterans' lives are linked in ways that civilian lives often are not linked. And I think that has implications for how we think about veterans, how veterans think about themselves, and how we work on interventions for them. So, for example, an observation I've made is that many veterans like to engage in building interventions for other veterans, participating in interventions for other veterans, and there's often an appetite for group activities that give them the social cohesion that they had when they were serving. And so I see this time and time again. It presents challenges to organizations that have to approve or pay for programs when you have veterans coming to us all the time who have actually made their own interventions. I think we have to pay a lot of attention to those interventions, but I think that's all an outcome of this linked live kind of concept. Then there's adjustment and transition itself, and this is very close to Carl's ideas that we need to look at all the military transitions. That's into service, during military life, and to civilian communities. Noting that when you come into military service, it's different for different people. So, for example, Chase Millsap, he went to a military college. So he actually started his military identity before he joined the service. And so different people will come into military life in different ways. But one of the outcomes of that is that you will develop a sense of purpose related to, in the context of your military career, as well as a military identity. And so I think part of what Chase was saying when he said, I don't know who I am, was related to issues related to his military to civilian identity and civilian life. Military to civilian life is a process. It's not a point in time. So on the diagram there, the blue arrow, there's no exact start and beginning date to when military to civilian transition starts. For some people, it's the day they start because they already know what they're planning and when they're going to release. But the red arrow, which is a shorter arrow, I call that the peri-release period. That's the point that starts about a year before they leave and up to about 2 years after. And that's when organizations tend to put a lot of effort and energy into structuring the transition process per se. If you're developing military to civilian transition programs, my view is that they have to be comprehensive. So these are what I call the domains of well-being or the domains of adjustment. So they include things like employment, which provide, all of these are bidirectional, by the way. They all impact each other. But one would be employment or having a meaningful activity. Culture is important. That's culture from coming inside the military to releasing from the military to civilian life. But it's also the broader culture, how well we accept people and how we approach veterans when they're leaving. That has a big, big impact on how well they will do. Social engagement includes issues of connectivity that I think Carl also talked about. Life skills. If people have lived in a very supportive environment, Carl called it, I think, a collective environment, it may mean that there's special needs for some veterans to develop life skills to be effective in civilian life. Health, of course, is critical. Changing healthcare systems for some veterans, but also related to injury and chronic illness resulting from military service. And of course, finance is key. And that also includes access and ease of getting veteran benefits, which is an ongoing issue for veterans in many, many countries. So here's a few more points that I think are really important in designing programs. One is that it should be really carefully modeled on our good understanding of the needs and perspective of military personnel as they approach release, during release, and after release. I've just mentioned the point that it has to be comprehensive. There's a real tendency to say, well, it's all about employment. So some jurisdictions will focus just on one dimension. In Canada, we focused a lot. We thought, well, really what we should focus on is medical releases. In fact, maybe that's really where we should put most of our effort, into medical releases. And I'll show you in a minute why that's not a good idea. In terms of our programs, we have to measure inputs, outputs, but also outcomes. There's a tendency not to measure outcomes in these programs. That's outcomes in civilian life. So a lot of times employment and rehabilitation programs will look at when people are job ready, not whether they got a job or not whether it was a satisfying job that met their needs. The issue that's also been discussed has been this issue around integration across military and civilian organizations. It's surprising how difficult it is to have a well-integrated, seamless relationship on the subject of transition between the departments of defense and civilian veteran organizations. That takes years and years to sort out, but it's absolutely critical. And an all-of-community approach. I think at the heart of that is the idea that it's not just veterans who went to war. We all made that decision. So when they come back, we all have a responsibility to engage in supporting veterans when they return to their communities. And a good example of that, I think, is the LA Collaborative that the SIR team has been working on. And finally, I'm a big supporter of Carl Castro's work that he's done in theory, which gives us an overarching look at transition and allows us to think about the big picture, which is absolutely essential. So just a note on Canadian evidence. So how difficult is transition? Well, we've done a number of large-scale population-based surveys, and we ask a question about adjustment. And across the two administrations of the study, it's been pretty stable that across this population base, everyone who's released since 1998, about 25% say it was difficult or very difficult, and about 2/3 say that it was easy. There's a list of some of the things that are associated with difficult transition. Some are release ways of being released: medically released and voluntarily released. Voluntarily released means if you were laid off, more or less, or released for behavioral reasons, physical and mental health conditions, not being employed, non-commissioned rank. We've actually looked in detail at rank. I don't know what anyone would think, what rank gets the worst burden in terms of outcomes in the life after military service. In our work, it's the master corporal rank or equivalent that does most poorly across most of our measures. And at the bottom there, I've noted that 60% who say they had very difficult adjustment were not medically released. So medically released do have problems with a release to civilian life. But actually, most veterans who had a very difficult adjustment, they were not medically released. They were released in other forms of release. So to focus only on medically released will mean that you'll only be addressing less than half of those who had difficult release issues. This is what an income transition actually looks like. One of the things that we've been able to do is we've been able to link, and this is a census actually, we've been able to link everyone who released since 1998 to everyone's income file. That's about 90% of the income files using Revenue Canada data. So that's what an income transition actually looks like, before and after transition. I think that's in 2011 constant dollars, which means they leave at about $70,000. They have an increase related to special payments upon release. They lose about 6% of their income, and then it takes about 7 or 8 years to recover that loss. Not everyone has an experience like that. For example, if you're medically released, you'll lose about 20% of your income and never recover it. If you're a woman, you'll lose about 20% of your income and have difficulty recovering it. And there are other. And if you look more generally, 70% of veterans were satisfied with their finances after release. The unemployment rate in Canada for veterans is about the same as the civilian rate. 73% were satisfied with their work, and they were about half as likely to experience low income using Statistics Canada low income measures as non-veterans. And only about 1 or 2% in any given year are on like a social welfare or social assistance kind of supports. Whoops. I showed this slide yesterday. It's just to show that veterans in Canada have about 2 to 3 times the level of chronic health conditions in the life after military service as other Canadians. There's a preponderance towards physical health burden, especially conditions that result in activity limitation and difficulties like chronic pain, back problems, and arthritis. But similarly, the mental health conditions are also elevated. This is really about difficulty functioning. So this is across 4 domains of functioning: school, home, work, and other settings and activities of daily living. So what you saw on the previous slide translates into difficulties with activities and functioning in daily living. So for example, while the employment rate might be about the same, veterans may need more accommodations because they have about 3 times the level of issues with activity limitations in the workplace as non-veterans. On the subject of research priorities, these are some closing ideas. I think we need to have a really deep understanding of the military to civilian transition experience. So one of the research projects we're doing right now, the one I just showed you gives us a lot of insight into the life after military service, but not what happens in transition itself. So one of our studies is a large-scale 3-point qualitative longitudinal study where we're interviewing 100 veterans while they're serving, preparing to leave, after they leave, and about a year to 18 months into the life after service. We're trying to understand something that we see, which is the health findings that I showed you in the life after service are a lot worse than they were before service. So we want to find out if there's what's happening in transition that might be contributing to that. And that's the gap that we're missing right now. We don't understand the really detailed story about transition, how it impacts veterans, and what kind of assistance makes the most difference. One of the things missing that the Institute of Medicine mentioned a few years ago in its report was that there's really very little data on effectiveness of military to civilian transition programs. And that's kind of a black hole. It's a missing piece. So that's a high priority. I'm a big supporter and grateful for Carl Castro's work. I really think that these kinds of models that he has been working on that will allow us to develop hypotheses around the entire MCT process is really important work, because we still don't have an agreed upon sort of framework or theory that can help direct us in his work. Families have also been mentioned as a critical area. I agree with that. We're currently undertaking a qualitative family study in transition, and also work on populations that most veterans are men. So we have not focused on women and some other special populations who we know have special issues, sometimes while serving and also in military to civilian transition. So thank you very much. So that ends the program in terms of our speakers, and there should be an opportunity, I think, for some questions. Cherry.
You haven't really mentioned anything specifically about people who've been trained in combat, and how do they get over that sort of training, really, to transition into civilian life. For example, when I was a face-to-face social worker, what I actually dealt with was with someone who had accidentally killed someone because the person came up behind him and he just turned around and responded in such a way that he killed him. And it wasn't intentional as such, it was just a response. And I wonder how many soldiers, come back into civilian life with those sort of issues and problems.
That's a great question. We have looked at that and continue to look at those issues in some detail. So it's fundamentally getting at this idea of the impact of killing someone and whether or not that someone you killed is an enemy combatant or a non-combatant. And in the example you gave, we would probably say that's a non-combatant, given just what you said. And we know that from the research, killing a non-combatant is more traumatizing to the individual than killing a combatant. In fact, the research shows that you actually do better if you kill a combatant than if you don't have any combat experiences. Now, of course, if you just said it like that, the media would go crazy and say, oh, the military is training people to enjoy killing other people, right, because they do better. But you have to keep in mind the context in which those two types of behaviors are supported by the military and their peers. So if I'm a infantryman and I kill a bunch of insurgents, not only is my unit going to pat me on the back and tell me what a great job I've done, I might likely get a medal, right? So it's a highly reinforced, socially acceptable behavior, and that has a positive impact on how you adapt to that traumatic event. If you kill a non-combatant, the exact opposite happens. There's an investigation. What happened? You're on the defensive. Everyone kind of stays away from you. So it's really important also to understand that social context. And it's not easy to move beyond those types of events because they're done. It's happened. You can't get it back. And those people generally, those soldiers and Marines primarily, they have to carry that with them for the rest of their life. So the focus there is on how to accept, how to cope with the acceptance of what happened, nightmares generally from the limited research that's been conducted continue for a lifetime. And this is not unusual amongst World War II veterans either. So you can, every war, these types of reactions and responses are typical. So anyway, I hope that began answering your question, but it's very difficult. There's also been a large, not a large, but an emerging research emphasis on moral injuries. So these kinds of things where you feel you've transgressed against your own sort of personal beliefs or morality, like killing someone who's innocent, killing a child accidentally, those kinds of things.
It's very closely related to this. We're, with social work, also engaged in newer community holistic approaches to training police. And I've heard conflicting read conflicting evidence about, one evidence says that people who've been in the military, because they've been in, especially those who've been in combat situations, are more capable in reacting to potentially violent situations if they go into the police force or security domestically. They're not as jittery, they're not as quick to try to shoot somebody, etc. But on the other hand, this kind of example, I just wonder if that's the case. And is there any concrete evidence about the effectiveness of veterans who've been in combat situations who go into the security?
That's a great question. And so it's on a scale. So in this example, this person could be in that early stages of having confidence. And so they still are jittery, right? And the people, as you get more experience, you're less likely to panic and shoot someone or kill someone when you don't need to, right? And the idea is, and I proposed this for this particular case example, instead of training police, which I'm for, but the focus shouldn't be on training police to use nonviolence. What you ought to teach them is to be so confident in their ability to exact violence, they'll feel the less need to do so. Because almost all this, not all, but a great majority of police killing unarmed civilians, almost invariably the police officer says, I was scared. I felt threatened. So if you give them the skills so they don't feel threatened, that they're not scared, then they're not going to accidentally kill you. They'll do it on purpose, okay? So that's, but then you also then want them to have those skills on how to de-escalate violence. And that you get through experience and through practice. And hopefully you get that in training, so it's not, you're not learning it on real people. In this situation here, and the reality is we send very young people to combat, and they are learning it as they go. I mean, that's just a fact that they learn as they go. I think Dave wanted to make a comment.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask if anyone else does first.
I think
Well, here.
I'll take it down to him there. I'll do it last. Go ahead. John.
Thanks. I think there are two elements. There is the training that military folk undertake that they're not untrained from when they transition to civilian life, that often does hold them in stead in terms of occupations in first responding and emergency services. There is then the overlay of stressful and traumatic experiences which can heighten that. So often it's not just the post-traumatic mental health problems that they need to adjust to, it's the fact that civilian life is culturally so much different. It's unruly, it's not ordered. You can't trust the person next to you. You don't always know what to do. And these elements that were heavily trained into personnel remain, and it becomes problematic in the workplace, it becomes problematic with children and the family situation. And so I think you need to look at it from both of those perspectives, the role of training as well as the overlay of stress and trauma.
Anyone else want to address that? Anybody? Yeah, there you go.
I want to talk about the Korean situation. A part of some veterans, it's not the officials, because we have the draft system. So most men should have the military duty. So the enlistment, as an enlistment, they have the military violence in the barrack, the life. So many people just traumatized and have a depression. So a lot of the mental issues. However, as you said, the Professor Chair, we don't have the mental issue, the mental health, the proportions. So we needed to utilize the private sector, such as military social worker. So the Korea reached some beginning the stage to discuss about some military social work. So the Yonsei University and our research team just to push it with the government to encourage to pull up the social worker. So there's a very important issues in Korea. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just make a final, those are great questions. I'll just make a quick comment as well. I guess my observation is that because of the nature of military service and some of the experiences like the ones you've mentioned, is that for some veterans, there's almost it's like a process of reconciliation that they go through after they leave. And one of the barriers to that is that if we define how people access services from like a medical disability, primarily from like a medical disability pension kind of model, then they'll have to meet thresholds in order to get help. But these can be just sort of complex reconciliation issues related to things that happen in service. And so I think that there's going to be a need for counseling services for some veterans when they need it, whether or not they have, whether they meet thresholds for mental health conditions, to help recontextualize some of their thinking around their experiences. And I also think that's part of what's going on with a lot of these group activities that you see in Canada and the United States, which is that part of wanting to help other veterans so much comes from this kind of reconciliation that's going on with military service. It's part of like working away and working out. Another observation that I've noted is that a lot of veterans write a lot. They're writing books, they're writing about their experiences, and I think that's part of that reconciliation as well. It's a way of trying to process it and come to terms with some of the experiences they've gone through, which are almost unthinkable from the experiences that many civilians would experience in their careers or day-to-day life. So I think it's a really important, moral injury is kind of complex and developing, but I think it's starting to touch on this, and it's something that I've thought is a priority where I work for rethinking access to services, that we're not going to be helping people, that we're going to be excluding a lot of people that need this kind of support with this kind of limited medical disability lens to when we provide help. Any other questions? Yes.
Dave, I just wanted to add one point to the concluding remark that you made, and that's the concept of who served. Actually, families served. The spouses served. And I think in the societal discussions of who should benefit from follow-up services, who should be considered in the transitions, because some of the military families, especially in the U.S., make transitions right along with their spouse. And those who don't are left behind. So I think we're not doing it here, but to examine what it means to really think of who served. This has come up here actually with an interest, as there's been more interest in the U.S. in female, as the U.S. has become more interested and involved in the role of women in the military, there's also been this parallel discussion by women veterans, as to the differential definition that's applied to them and to the men who serve. So sometime in the future, we should come back to that topic, I think.
Comments?
Yeah, you know, man, that's a great point, and it needs to start with the definition of a family and a spouse and a partner that's independent of the veteran. So right now, the definition of a spouse is linked to being married to a veteran. So if you get a divorce, during service, after service, you're out. You're not even an entity that exists in the minds of veterans or the DOD or anybody else. And I think that mindset of that linked dependency has got to be separated, and that's hugely controversial, to say the least. But I think we have to grapple with that in order to address the very issues that you're talking about, because it's why they're not eligible for anything, because they don't really serve, they haven't really suffered, they really shouldn't have any problems. This is for veterans, this is for, right, so.
So actually, we still agree about your perspectives and applications with families. So last year, actually, we applied some military social work programs with families. So it is a very influential effect we found. So that subject of the some experimental groups, they found some lower depression and lower violent behaviors. So we came from this. So we needed to the military social mental health program with families. It is needed to complicate the military communities.
I add his explanation. Last couple of years, we had a serious problem in the suicide in the soldiers, among soldiers, and then violence between the soldiers. You know, Korea is a mandatory system, military service. Every man should serve for 2 years. And a lot of young generation, they're very hard to adjust their life in the new. Can I talk?
Oh, yeah, no,
okay.
Sorry,
okay.
Okay.
So, a couple of times, like a gun shooting fight, and it's in the soldiers, among soldiers. So we ask about some social program in the for the young soldiers. So we start with the young soldiers who have been depressed or who have a lot of trouble with some suicidal attempts, and so we did some experimental design, and we gave us some family therapy for those soldiers and their families. So the result finding, we have to find out that is they're dramatically who received the family therapy at the same time their personal therapy, the group has dramatically they improve their mental health. So now we are talking about the more implement this kind of social program in our military services. Yeah.
Come visit us in Australia, and I'll introduce you to our Veterans and Veterans Families Counselling Service, freely available to veterans, their partners, their former partners and their children.
There's another question that I'd like to ask that we haven't actually touched upon either, and that's people of colour. And yesterday, you actually mentioned, one of the panelists actually mentioned about the fact that people went into the military for all different reasons. And one of them was actually employment and status, and to be able to feel like they were stakeholders in this society. So my question is, on transition, is there any research around the fact that people of colour perhaps have more difficulty transition into society because of discrimination and all the aspects of disadvantages that they have within the society itself?
So I'm gonna make a quick final. I wanted to give one quick to the Dean's thing first on families, just before we move. In Canada, we call the issue the problem of derivative eligibility, and that's what Carl's talked about. But that's what we call it. And in program design and development, when you get into derivative eligibility, that's when you get into stuff where you start doing really weird things because you're doing gymnastics to meet the needs of families. You get into doing stuff that looks crazy because you can't do what's right. So that's one issue. But another issue is I've watched this for a long time because I've been interested in families and having spouses and families eligible for benefits in their own rights. And this is what I've seen happen, is that families is always on the advocacy agenda in Canada. It's always number 3 or 4. And so it stays there. It's really important, it's really important, it's really important. But when it comes down to making the decision around, say, adding eligibility to a new group, it always comes down to, well, wait a minute, all the veterans aren't eligible yet. So if all the veterans aren't eligible, then the sort of the penny drops and another veteran group gets eligible, or so it usually ends up in the advocacy world, which plays a big role in what happens in veteran benefits, that families never make it to the #1 issue. If they could ever make it to the #1 issue, I think we would have some movement, but you'd really need to talk to the advocacy community about how to move this one forward. That's my experience. And now I'll pass that on to the next excellent question. Sorry, Chair.
So again, another great question, and we are doing research in our group looking at the gender and ethnic transition issues, and there are issues because, you know, they're coming back to a society in where there are still issues, and they don't go away simply because they've been away. One of the interesting things that we're also seeing, though, is that African American and Hispanic veterans have a stronger identity to the military than they do to an ethnic or racial group, with the exception of female veterans. Women veterans still have a stronger identity to their ethnic and racial group. And I think that's a reflection of two things. One, how well the military does in instilling a military identity over your ethnic and racial identity, but it also, on the flip side, speaks to probably the experiences that women have in the military, that, you know, discrimination, sexual harassment, sexual assaults, that keeps their identity stronger. It's lower, but it's still stronger. But yes, this is a very important issue, and particularly in relationship to access to VA services and employment, in particular on the outcomes that we've looked at. And I've always asked Canada, like, do you worry about this issue? And so I'll let Dave answer the response when I asked him that.
And the answer is I'm actually not qualified to answer that one. The last time I checked, the last time, I want to be careful what I say here because I don't want to be wrong, but the last time I checked, the percentage of visible minorities in the Canadian forces was very low compared to the U.S. forces. So I'll correct that if I'm wrong. but it has not been as big an issue in my experience as it has been in the United States. So anyway, I don't feel qualified to answer.
Yeah, and that's also, you get also at kind of another issue, and that is the diversity of the U.S. military in particular, which is really, really a diverse organization. But it's not a reflection of the diversity in the civilian sector, right? So if you just, I mean, the gender one is obvious, right? 51% of the military is not female, right? We all know that. But even when you look at, like, you know, the different types of Asian groups, African American, Latino, it's not representative. And I know for a long time the U.S. military would say, you know, we're a reflection of society, you know, meaning but that's really not true any longer. It may have been true at one point, but as the diversity has changed, the military ratios have not kept pace with that.
Jerry, for us, we have some minority groups that are serving in the IDF, in the Israeli Defense Force, and mostly Druze and Bedouin Muslims, and they find it very hard to reintegrate to their society, and there is a growing evidence that they suffer from more severe combat PTSD, and they can't find jobs after they're coming back. Although sometimes it's families that have been joining the military and succeeding in the military. When they retire, they find it very hard to readjust and rejoin the minority group that they live with. So they live in different villages or areas in towns. They're not fully embedded in the Israeli society, and that is extremely hard for them. So that's a great point, and it would be interesting to see the differences in minorities or in minority groups.
For a study that never got off the ground, but I agree.
Okay.
I agree.
Well, I'm not qualified for the question, but I think that the question is very interesting. Korea is a very homogeneous society, so we don't have any different ethnics. However, there are a growing number of female soldiers in Korea. 7% nowadays is 7% of soldiers are the females. So we expect there are more growing number of veterans are females. Mostly the females are the nurses. So after they retire, it is very easy to get the job. So there is a lot of benefits. So, however, now different area of nursing. Now there are a number of growing of many females. It's interesting getting to the military service because it is a very good job. So now I think that your question is very good. So we have to consider those kind of the diversity. Thank you.
So I want to come back to especially Carl's presentation, and it has partly to do, you know, I recently read the book Hillbilly Elegy. I don't know if you read it. You know, the interesting thing about there is that going through these transitions for the main character in the book was extremely positive. In fact, he had a very hard time coping with life. He couldn't get into Ohio State because he couldn't figure out how to fill out the application. He didn't have very good habits, et cetera. He wasn't very disciplined. His mother was a drug addict and so on. He ended up going into the military, and he found that he gained skills, life skills, discipline, sense of self-worth, ability to fill out forms. And when he came out, he got into Ohio State just like that, and the rest is history. He ended up going to Yale Law School. And there must, I have a nephew that same kind of thing happened to. He was kind of floundering around out of high school, and he went into the Marines. It changed his life in an extremely positive way. So one question is, when you frame transition theory, it's a negative. You know, it's susceptibility to negative outcomes. But I'm wondering if we're going to have a theory of transition, there has to be, you know, positive outcomes, because just in my limited experience and from reading, it's actually a very positive set of transitions for some people. So that's the first part of the question. The second is, I noticed the data that you showed were basically differences between people in the military and not in the military on certain characteristics. And then you did have a figure after, one of them was high, I remember, the 85% on one, but then the other one wasn't that high on suicides in the first 2 years. Because it would seem to me that if you're really developing a transition of, or a theory of transitions, it's those transition periods. You actually need charts or graphs or models that show it's those periods where people are having these issues or vulnerabilities, not just the differences between being in or out of the military.
Right. Absolutely,
and, so that's just the second part. But my main curiosity is about the first, what about the positive side of transition?
I totally agree, and it's not that military service isn't a positive experience. So the military transition isn't talking about that. They're talking about when you leave that very positive experience and move into a different transition to another context, that's when things are likely, you're more susceptible for things going bad than if you're just staying in that positive context. So it doesn't talk at all about military being a positive or negative experience at all. That would be, I think, a different theory, and I totally agree that, and I think I said this yesterday, that the military is one of the few very large organizations that truly allows for upward mobility in American culture. I'd be hard-pressed to find another organization that, you know, on the mass level, 2 million, 3 million individuals going through the military that allows for this upward mobility from a socioeconomic, from a standard of living, from a contribution, et cetera. You'd be really hard-pressed to find a group that does that, you know, by design almost. And, you know, the military is very, very engaged in individual personal development, right? I mean, that's what we spend most of our time in the military doing. So totally agree. The point of the theory wasn't to say, but when you think about transitions, there's nothing, the thing about the transition, and you got me thinking about this now, when people sometimes on the motivation to serve, they leave their kind of, there's a small group, but an important group, who leave adverse situations to join the military. And so in that sense, the transition could be a very positive experience. So I totally agree with you. And the data, by the way, was just kind of exemplars to pick out. And I could give you more and more examples of that, but your point is very well taken on that. I agree.
And I'll just make a quick comment on that as well. There actually is some data on that, but it's World War II veterans that were studied. So there were studies done, I think, in the 1990s, where there were sort of multi-dimensional scales on World War II veterans to find out how they evaluated military service in the context of their life. And by and large, they felt that it was a positive experience. For many of them, it was wind at their back. They learned leadership skills. They learned they were more effective. They could work better in groups. They had better decision making. They were more mature. And so in the context of the life course, the World War II story is that military service was a good thing for me. So I'm guessing that's probably the case across, could well be the case across the current generation as well. I think we're getting to the point where we need to end the session. So just to our panelists, I'd like to say kamsahamnida and thank you for the presentations. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. So our intention this morning for the last bit of our session, and we've been giving serious consideration, haven't we, on how the outcomes of this symposium and how we can actually translate an ongoing action research initiative and build on some of the things that we have discussed and how we can actually go forward with the APRU on this, because that is crucial and important. So for part of our committee, we have Dr. Castro and Dr. Dave Pedler, but we also have Dean Flynn with us, and she has some ideas too. And we also have Dean Jack Knott, and he has some ideas too. So the idea is to actually let people be free enough to open these dialogue, really, so that we can find a common ground where we can galvanize what we've actually trying to do in a successful way. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave, and that will be, but he's going to give the Dean the opportunity to speak first. Am I correct? And then they will follow up, and then Jack, and then they will say their bit. So you're first, Marilyn, Jack second, and then the team. Okay. All right.
Okay. All right. Well, I think this is our opportunity to thank General Secretary Chris Tremewan. I just found out he's named after a saint, a Cornish saint. And to thank my collaborator in planning, Dean Jack Knott, and our keynote speaker, Jeff Talley, and especially Dean Cherry Short and her assistants, Susan and Dan. Dean Short put in 2 years of work to bring us all here, and I'm especially grateful for her persistence and for her deep interest in making this a success. And of course, I would like to thank our outstanding panel members. I think all of you have given such good thought and brought such important information to this occasion. The question that I'd like to raise is one that's of interest to APRU, which was the sponsoring organization for our meeting, the host in the sense of the conceptual host. Is what we're talking about in this meeting a key global challenge? And from my point of view, it is, and I hope we can continue to develop our thinking in that framework. There were a few conclusions or a few observations that occurred to me as I was listening to all of you over the past 2 days, and I'd like to briefly identify those observations as possible points for future interest and development. One thing that became clear to me is that actually veterans policy is really social policy with broad economic and political consequences for the entire population, both service-related and civilian. To some extent, we do ourselves a disservice by defining this as veterans policy, since in fact we are talking about national social policy and the integration of our thinking about what we do with veterans and the consequences for the entire civilian population. The second thing that seemed very evident to me was that all of you are touching very different data sources, most of which are either underdeveloped or are available but have not been exploited yet for the purposes of exploring veterans policy. One of the best examples is something that General Talley brought up, which is the development of predictive analytics and using predictive analytics to identify vulnerable populations among veterans. But in addition, just this group itself and its efforts to make international comparisons really reaffirmed for me that we have very strong areas of potentially compatible data and compatible comparisons. So this is one of the cases really where international comparisons are tremendously valuable, where there's potential data available and universal interest. A third thing that struck me was actually the absence of government officials. It was interesting that, you know, Dean Nott is, of course, intimately connected with government activities, as are we in a different way. And yet in our discussions for this first round, we did not consider bringing them. Certainly if we continue, we would hope, I think, to make them a part of this dialogue so we can connect research to policymaking. Some of our discussions here were focused, of course, on data collection alone or on the results of our research, but this connection to policymaking is, of course, what makes this of global interest and ultimately of broad social importance. Another observation that was both direct and indirectly occurred to me was the value of administrative systems that are simple and responsive, and how important it is for us to think about examining those administrative systems in different ways as an element in policy impact. Most of us complain about the administrative systems, but the actual redesign and then the exploration of the impacts of redesign is something that universities should be good at and could be incredibly important in terms of improving the impact even of existing institutions and policies. I was impressed by the comments that were made about the impact of specific health conditions, specifically chronic pain, that seems to have a very strong correlation with poor post-discharge adjustment and seems to impact mental health. These conditions need fresh attention, fresh priority, and they need triaging for treatment as a matter of administrative policy. And I think this is a direction that I have not heard much about before, so I think it's extremely valuable. Another thing that struck me was the economic analysis that was done. On our first day, and unfortunately I missed our last panel, but it's very clear that the economic analysis of veterans policy raises a lot of challenging issues and questions that need to be revisited. We seem to have some standard assumptions. We need to bring different economic frameworks to look at veterans policy, and maybe to have an overall consideration of how our underlying assumptions about incentives and so on may or may not be correct. It is also clear that from the economic analysis that was presented, that veterans policy has a direct impact in some form on work incentives, productivity, and human capital development. So, and the interaction, especially with national social security systems, the adequacy of benefits, and the methods of financing really require deeper analysis and possibly policy reform. I think we tend to segment the discussion of these issues rather than taking the entire social security system into our purview. And the more we have these independent systems outside of compensation, the more problems I think we have in implementation. Anyway, this is an important area for economic analysis. I think I've already mentioned the value of international comparisons, but another thing that struck me was this general trend in Asia that was mentioned also as possibilities, maybe in Korea, but certainly I know is occurring in Taiwan and some other Asian nations, and that is the transition between universal conscription and a volunteer military, and what the implications are for all the benefit systems, for transition, for recruitment, for every element of the relationship between civilian life and military life when this transition is made. And I think people have not been considering, generally, have not taken a sufficiently broad scope in considering what are the policy implications of this transition, and then what does it mean for training and so on. We've talked a lot about the vulnerability of veterans to suicide, sexual assault, and other personal crises, and how this is affected by transition in military service, beginning with recruitment and extending through civilian life, perhaps through the lifetime of individuals themselves. Again, this is an area that requires broad rethinking, policy development, because very few of our transition our approaches to transition begin with recruitment. They usually begin with discharge, or they begin with 3 weeks before discharge, but it is not a concept actually of occupational health and occupational welfare. If one imposes that sort of framework, a framework of occupational health, in thinking about how we deal with issues in the military, then we know that our recruiters from the very beginning are going to prepare people for discharge, whether it's after a career or it's 2 years later. The preparation starts then. The transition starts then. So the final thing that I wanted to comment is something that I was discussing with the General Secretary, and that was the notion of the social function of the military. We were commenting that for example, in China, the main function of the military is really disaster relief, to intervene at times when there are major earthquakes, fires, other profound trauma in society. And this is an aspect of the military that has profound importance to civilian society as a whole. This is also true in the Philippines and in almost every other country. And for us to explore the implications of the social functions of the military in preparing societies for disaster, for climate change, might be a dimension that we would all wish to work on and think about. By implication, we still have all the other issues of how you compensate soldiers who are injured in this process and how you enter and relate to civilian society. All the issues we talked about remain important, but looking at the military from this social perspective keeps us out of areas of sensitivity in security matters and helps us keep a clear focus on the social and behavioral aspects of the military in our midst. So I want to thank you all. I hope we can continue our joint exploration of multinational research initiatives, our identification of data sources, our exploration of how the continuum of services and support can be defined or redefined, and how we develop comparisons that promote our understanding of universal problems. Thank you.
Well, let me also thank all of you for participating in this really fascinating symposium. It produced more data analysis and analytic models and thought than I anticipated. Maybe I had too low expectations, but the panels were really fascinating. I'm not an expert in this area, but I found myself really drawn in from all the panels starting yesterday and through today. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing and the being able to come together in this way. It was striking to me that, let's see, I'm trying to remember who said this to me. I think it was, no. It was, yes, I think I think it was I don't know if Robert Rosenbeck, is that his name, who said that he's been in this field for 30 years or 40 years, and he has never, in all that time, in all of his many papers and everything that he's given, had a group come together and address veterans policy from an international, comprehensive, holistic perspective. So he felt this was unique, and I was really impressed by that statement. That just really stuck in my mind, that we may be doing something here, bringing people together in a way that nobody else has done around an issue that, if, as Marilyn pointed out, affects all aspects of society, but is understudied and understood. It's just really not focused on enough. So I wanted to make a few specific points. Some of these will overlap with Marilyn's points. So, you know, we were sitting here hearing the same things. But here goes. First of all, it seems quite clear to me that we need an overall veterans policy that is more comprehensive than the U.S. has, and maybe that many of our other countries have. We were just listening to the Korean example, South Korean example, where there was, from what I understood, a fairly good focus on the medical aspects, but not on many of the other aspects that veterans face. And we clearly have a veterans department, but we don't have a broad-based policy that focus on veterans in all the various dimensions that goes from housing to employment to social services to mental health and all the things that we've been talking about. And we need one. Now, this is hard to do in the U.S. Because of the fragmented kind of policy system that we have. But I think it's something that would be a very important development, something that we could help design and think about and work with policymakers on. Second is organization. It struck me that, I can't again remember who exactly said this, but I wrote it down, and is that it seemed unclear, for example, with employment, whether it's the Department of Labor, I'm going to use the U.S. example, or whether it's the Department of Veterans Affairs, or, you know, who's responsible for this. Of course, some aspects of health are done elsewhere. It kind of does reflect, at least again, the U.S. fragmented policymaking system, but I think there could be some important thought given to the organization and administration and implementation of veterans policy broadly defined, and kind of identifying where the different responsibilities are and thinking that through in a way that, you know, the DOD is paying the Department of Labor all this money every year, et cetera, and so on. I think that's probably true elsewhere as well, but I would also add to this public-private partnerships. What is a meaningful role for nonprofits and business in partnership with government in doing this? Somebody mentioned there are 30,000 nonprofits or something that are engaged in this field. They tend not to coordinate what they're doing. There isn't an overall strategy that involves an intersectoral kind of approach. And so that's, I think, another very important area for examination and further research. Third is one that Marilyn mentioned. I'm going to elaborate maybe on it in a little different way, and that's the use of big data and data analytics to be smarter in where we address resources. So it was quite striking to me that Dave Pedlar, for example, talked about the shared determinants of that come together that tend to cause challenges or issues. If we can start to collect data, especially big data, where we have really detailed knowledge of the interaction effects of different shared determinants, that we can then target resources to those areas of need, because, you know, not every veteran needs the kind of supports across the whole board. And if we can do that, I think that will use our resources much more wisely and allow us to be much more effective in the application of those resources. I even recall that I think it was the person from Israel that, and again, I don't remember who exactly said this, but talked about the no way out combined with stress, right? So again, it's a combination of things that lead to challenges, and data analytics and big data ought to be able to help us more effectively target those things. Third, I was struck even by the recent presentation on Korea about the importance of respect. We started out with that with General Talley, and several people have mentioned this. And it plays out in various ways. Part of it is the idea of compensation for having served the country and maybe being injured in that process, independent of being able to get particular services for needs that you have. That was mentioned several times. And thinking through the role of respect and recognizing the sacrifice that people make and how to compensate for that, possibly in conjunction with the normal services and other supports, but currently, at least in the U.S., it's done in addition to. There's a compensation element beyond the actual need. You know, you could have do very well in business and make a lot of money, but you still could be compensated. I think figuring that out is a very important fourth element. Fifth is something that I made a comment on to Carl earlier, but I think it's worth repeating. And I think it's very important to understand models of transition that are both positive and negative. There are some transitions for people that are actually extremely positive, I think. And trying to understand the conditions under which lead in different directions or might be reinforcing negative, for example. Sometimes you can get reinforcing kind of negative results, or reinforcing positive results. Thinking a little more dynamically and both in a positive and negative way about transitions, I think could be, I think the focus on transitions is incredibly important, and I found your presentation and the other presentations on transitions to be really fascinating. But it's an area where I think when we start thinking of models, we have to start thinking also about how sort of positive reinforcement in some cases that can really lead to good outcomes. And then I also wanted to mention that Courtney's paper I found really interesting on trying to understand the effects of policy change on behavior and the uptake of the policy. I think I was, not surprised, I guess, because we have a lot of papers that are given on policy change and the effect of policies on behavior, but it's very complex to do. It's not that easy to sort out what is the, even from the comments that we heard on her paper of actually what is caused by the policy and what is caused by other things, and how do we isolate that. But really working to understand that, the effects of policy and policy change, I think is a very important research enterprise. Because we often, when you talk about hypotheses, that's what you're basically talking about. You're hypothesizing that a particular policy is going to have a particular effect, and being able to understand and measure that, and especially the outcome of it, I think is hugely important. Yeah.
So we need a theory of how policy changes behavior, and then we can use the big data analytics to get
That's
that.
exactly right. That's exactly what, very well said. That's what I'm sort of focusing on. And then finally, I did want to say, another thing that struck me was the amazing commonality across countries on some dimensions of this. It's really striking. It is really a universal phenomenon. When, even from the last panel, but from Australia and Canada, we're all dealing in many ways with the same phenomenon. And so when that's the case, cross-country comparative studies are especially valuable, because we can look at differences in organization, we can look at differences in policies, looking at differences in context, et cetera, and see how they affect the outcomes, knowing that we're studying a really universal phenomenon. So that was a dimension of this that I found really, really valuable as well. Then in conclusion, I'm really more excited even than when I came into this to foster this international partnership. It has really multiple dimensions to it. It has incredible potential. Again, more than I really anticipated when I started out. I think that we have also a moral obligation not to just talk among ourselves and have meetings, but to engage policymakers and the business community and the nonprofit community in these ideas, and start to get some of the data and knowledge and incredible work that's being done here out into the field as well as into the military. I think the military can learn a lot from this also. We were, like with Marilyn, talking about a way to do this with APRU. In some ways, discussing the military and veterans, especially the military, is a very sensitive topic. The military plays different roles in different countries, and it's part of national security in all countries, and so it's hard sometimes to come together around a topic like that. But as we were discussing at the break, maybe taking an angle towards it that it does involve aspects of what the military does, more of the social aspects, especially, for example, disaster relief, is a way to get at this, because that also dovetails, as Chris has said, with some of the other things that APRU is doing. So we would fit into a broad area that APRU is focused on. It also could overlap also with APEC because it has economic consequences and economic dimensions to it. So, and Chris mentioned that at that OPEC meeting, APRU is now at the table. And so this would be a way to get some of these ideas and some of these aspects of the connection between the military and social issues on the agenda, possibly of that economic organization as well. So going forward, I would envision the following: hopefully, with the partnership of APRU, and certainly our two schools are interested in this, and our other university partners. Some collaborative research undertaking that might lead to some edited volume or might lead to some journal series, right, that is edited around this theme. I could very easily see an Asian or Asian American Pacific Rim journal that would pick this up and want to do a series of articles, edited articles around this. I think that would be a great kind of academic next step. I'd also really like to see us, as we move forward, to engage policymakers in the business community more, both in meetings that we have, but also in producing things for them, either policy briefs or testimony or other ways of interacting with policymakers and including the military, so that this gets outside of the halls of academia and into the outside world. And then finally, I think the dimension of this, as I mentioned, would be great to have a partnership, hopefully, conceivably around disaster relief. One of the areas that our school brings to this is we have a small number of people in our school that work on resilience and disasters, because disasters do occur. You can't completely prevent them from happening, and then the big question is, how can you be resilient in the midst of that? And so I think that's a very promising aspect. I certainly, even 5-6 years ago when I was doing a tour with the military, one of the exercises that we got involved in was a simulation of a disaster that occurred in Central America, and the coordination among the militaries there and the U.S. military and dealing with it. And it really touched on all kinds of aspects that we've been talking about, from healthcare to social services to housing and so on. So I think that would be a really valuable aspect. So thank you all again for participating. It's been a really fascinating 2 days. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to just put in a few thoughts before the final summing up from the experts. I have very much appreciated also being here, and a whole universe is open to me that I didn't know about before, so this has been very useful. And when I hear the figure 21 million veterans in the US, I reflect that's a fairly large, 7% of the population, I think. And I think of my whole country being 4 million. So yes, it's certainly an issue that is a serious one and needs to be taken up. And I'm also impressed, as others have said, the commonalities across the countries that are represented here. And so in terms of the question of how to follow up with APRU, I realize that's a subset of the actions you want to take. I mean, your research collaborations continue and expand on an academic level. I realize that what you may wish to do with us would be a particular focus and not comprehensive of everything that's been done here. And of course, it's already been mentioned that the militaries and countries around the 24 members of APEC play different roles, some common and some very different. And so how to shape a a focused yet comprehensive program of work amongst a broader range of nations or economies is quite a skilled process and quite a sensitive one. So if you're asking me, you know, what are the next steps? Well, of course, the answer from our point of view is that to find 6 or 10 of our member universities who have an interest in a particular project or program of work, to get them together and to propose a 3 to 5 year program with specific outcomes. We have moved away from just having a series of meetings with no outcomes. We actually, and already the Dean Knott has suggested some publications and some interaction with policymakers, and I support both those. And also, Dean Flynn has mentioned the emphasis, I think both deans mentioned the emphasis on, possible emphasis on disaster management, recovery, relief, and the social role of the military in those particular aspects. And as more extreme events hit the region, the Pacific Ring of Fire, all of us have to face an enhanced role for various kinds of civil defence. So I think that's quite a strong direction to at least propose at this point. It's also been mentioned that APRU is deeply involved now in the APEC policy-making process with governments. So we, apart from one business coalition of businesses, ABAC, we're the only non-government organisation sitting around the table with all the member governments in a number of fora. One is the Policy Partnership on Science, Technology and Innovation, where each government presents their scientific and innovation policies. And we bring the research university perspective to that and present on the capacities of our research universities in particular dimensions. And we're often somewhat overwhelmed by the requests from member governments for more information. We're also involved in the Human Resource Development Working Group, looking at issues of employment, labour mobility and so on. And in fact, this may be something of a paradigm for you. We've been, some of our members have got together through their own institutes and our member universities to produce papers on labour mobility, which are now used by member governments in the policy process. So we're also involved in something called EdNet, which is the coming up with an education strategy for the APEC economies. That sounds like an impossible task, and I think it is. But it's nevertheless a very dynamic way of sharing various strategies across the region and seeing the commonalities, if not coming up with a unitary plan. So these are some of the things we do, and APEC, as you may know, has many meetings, but most of them are focused around 2 senior officials meetings per year in the host economy. This year it's Vietnam. And we're also proposing that at the end of the year, at the national leaders meeting, where all the presidents and prime ministers go for their discussions, and also they usually have a photograph wearing the national dress of their host economy, which that is done in parallel with a CEO summit. And we're proposing at the moment to Vietnam and to the APEC Secretariat that there be within the CEO summit, a university leaders forum. And they have indicated to us last week that they're generally in favour of that, and we're waiting for the final approval. So there'll be a number of, there are already a number of intersections with the policy process at the working level, and there will hopefully be one at the political leaders level in the future. This would be a wonderful way for this group to start to bring things forward of interest to all economies and to national leaders. And one of the benefits that people find from attending these meetings is actually they can talk to their own national leaders in a way they often can't at home. So there are a number of very good opportunities through the APEC process. I won't take any more of your time, but just to say that I think what we need now in terms of our collaboration is to a working group of thinking this through and seeing what is likely to be a proposal which will see success. I want to thank you all for your participation and for involving us as APRU, and I look forward to future discussions. Thank you.
Well, do you want to give a comment on process just to make sure I'm... want to make sure I'm doing it the way you want. So.
Okay, so I suppose the next step is then we're actually looking at a way to go forward. So Chris mentioned a committee. I suppose the way to probably deal with that is for people to volunteer. Oh, okay. So that...
What's that, Marilyn? What did Marilyn say?
Marilyn is...
After the
yeah,
meeting, we
yeah.
can create a working group after this meeting.
Yeah.
Not volunteers right now.
So the idea is, sorry, just so I can make it more clear, is that we'll follow up and put a structure together and then go forward. But the idea is to make sure that everyone who's present here will be able to know what's going on, and we keep them informed. And the next step will definitely let you know what we intend to do. So I can't thank everybody enough for coming. I mean, it's been, I would say, a very rewarding event. Of course, I thank the Secretary General of the APRU, which is really nice to actually have him here, and the two deans. But I'd also like to thank Ken McGivray as well, because he has given quite a lot of consultant time to me to put this together, and it hasn't been an easy thing to do. So I'd like people to give him a round of applause. And the other person that I would really like to thank, and that is Kath. She's been with me continually throughout this process. She's worked incredibly hard on it. We have been at various different stages of this, and she has really stepped up to the plate. So I'd like you to give her a round of applause as well. And of course, to the committee, I would can only say that it's been a very innovative and interesting committee, and I thank you all for the participation that you've actually given. And of course, I wouldn't be able to close without giving another special thanks to Shantanu, and he's the APRU representative here, and he has been absolutely excellent. And he was able to get Chris engaged in this, and I thank him very much for that. So thank you. And so lunch will be served on the patio. And of course, General Tully for his wonderful feature speaking yesterday. And thank you so much. We're so pleased you're going to be part of USC. Thank you. No, they're not.